Hello, and welcome to Money Matters TV and our segment called Growth Stories, where we hear from entrepreneurs and advisors who share secrets and advice on what business owners need to know to grow. I'm your host, Mike Verrill, Vice President with the Sharp Financial Group. The problem for business owners is fractured business and personal financial advice. The solution is our unique integrated financial management approach. We have unified business accounting, tax, business advisory, investment banking, wealth management, and family office in a way that creates maximum value for business owners and helps them and their families achieve extraordinary things. From time to time, financial issues relating to life sciences, healthcare, and technology may be discussed on this show. Those discussions are not and should not be viewed as financial advice. Moreover, since the show is pre-recorded and shown at a later date, some of those discussions may no longer be relevant. It's always wise to seek advice from your financial advisor before entering into any financial transaction. I'm joined today by my co-host, Katie Wenger, Transaction and Advisory Associate at CBRE, a global real estate consulting firm. Katie specializes in providing high-growth companies in the Philadelphia region with real estate strategies to support their business objectives. Katie also serves as the advising committee member to the Philadelphia Alliance for Capital and Technology, also known as PACT, and is an active member of the Women's Network in Philadelphia. Katie, thanks for joining us. How are you? It's great to see you.
Hey, Mike. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk more about some growth stories.
Awesome. Our guest today has spent more than 25 years as an entrepreneur and also working side by side with entrepreneurs and business owners, really helping them understand the mechanics of what makes a business grow, how to scale it, and also do it profitably. So I'm very excited to delve into that and get some of his insight. Before we do that, we do have a question from one of our viewers. Thomas Hale from Philadelphia would like to know, will inflation help or hurt the real estate market in the U.S.? So obviously, I think you're very close to that, so I'd love to have your insight.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Thomas. It's certainly a good one. So CBRE actually recently released a global outlook report in August in which our chief economist, Richard Barkham, stated that while inflation is a concern and may cause some volatility, there is a positive outlook right now in the commercial real estate space, and economic growth is going to continue and is forthcoming. So we'll wait to see kind of what pans out. But as of now, that's kind of what we're seeing in our market.
That's great, Katie. Thanks for that information. And Thomas, hopefully that was helpful. It's always great to hear from our viewers. Here's how to send your questions to Money Matters TV.
You can have your questions answered on Money Matters. Please go to our website, money-matterstv.com. On our homepage, click on the banner on the right that says, Send us your questions. While you're on our website, you can find information about our hosts and guests, as well as show notes and links about this show and past shows. Money Matters is also available as a podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, so you can listen to Money Matters while you're on the go. That website address, again, is money, M-O-N-E-Y, -matters, M-A-T-T-E-R-S, TV.com.
Our guest today has so many great stories about operational improvements and strategic enhancements you can make to turn a business into a profitable growth engine. We are very pleased today to welcome to Growth Stories Jeff Stello, founder and managing partner of Charlestown Capital Partners. Jeff, Katie, and I are excited to help and happy to welcome you to our segment called Growth Stories.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Katie. Glad to be here.
Today, can you give us a quick overview about Charlestown Capital Partners and the types of projects that you get involved with?
Sure. We are a boutique transaction advisory and CFO advisory firm. We work primarily with private equity firms and their portfolio companies, but we also work with owner entrepreneurs. And going back in my earlier consulting days, did quite a bit of work with early stage companies and venture capital backed companies as well.
So what we always like to do, Jeff, is take the story back a few years, maybe than you've recently thought about, but always interested, we do talk on this show, are entrepreneurs made or are they born? But it's always interesting to get a sense of background and, maybe what it was like growing up. And, there's specific things in your childhood that you can relate to that maybe kind of pointed you on the path that you are today. So,
yes, preparing for the show was a little bit of a trip down memory lane. It was a good one. I grew up in central Pennsylvania in a very small town, large family with 6 children, 5 boys and a girl. So it was very competitive, very sports oriented. And our mother and father did not have the opportunity to go to college. So education was very important to them. And they pushed all of us to get a good education. And our father, he was the breadwinner in the home, and he turned out to be a very successful, self-taught civil engineer. So he worked with companies that built the interstate highways and the bridges that we enjoy today. And he later started his own business that serviced that group of companies. And I believe some of those entrepreneurial roots have definitely had an impact on how I've guided my career over the years.
That's amazing. Yeah. And you talked a little bit about your parents kind of thinking education was highly important. So for you, after college and you had this wonderful education, how did that impact your future career growth and really where you are today?
Well, I was an accounting major in college. And at that time, the typical path for the most successful students was to go in public accounting and get your certification. Because at that time, in order to be a CPA, you had to work for a minimum in Pennsylvania, a minimum of 2 years with a public accounting firm. So you could not get the required experience that you even have to have today, but you couldn't get it from a corporation or from a state agency. You had to work in public accounting. So that seemed to be the right path to go toward first and to get those credentials. But I always knew I wanted to get into the corporate world. I didn't think that public accounting would be a lifetime career for me.
You weren't on the partner track from day one.
No, when the partner came in after our second or third tax season and said, "Well, just think only 40 more of these and you could retire," I think that was enough to know that it was.
You said, "How about one or none?" Yeah, that is a baptism by fire, as they say. I think in public accounting, especially in those very large firms. What are some of the key things you learned while you were there? You spent time in audit, right? So you're really digging in the companies and really kind of understanding the numbers behind them. What was that foundation like for you, and how did that help you further in your other opportunities?
Yes, and it was a very good training ground because you did get exposed to a lot of different business, different industries, different processes and business models in a very short time period. It was very hard work, but I recommend it highly to accounting students nowadays when they're thinking about their career path. But back to your question of what you learned, you got some very good skills that I apply even today. The audit skills and the financial analysis skills that you use in preparing those audits. But I also learned, especially when I got out of public accounting, I thought I knew a lot about businesses, and I learned that I did not. From a practical standpoint, I had never even gone through a month-end closing process at a company because you're there after the fact and you're auditing. And even more so, you don't get much exposure, if any, to sales and marketing, product development, engineering, or manufacturing functions. So there was a quick ramp up when I went into the corporate world.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you kind of started in that public world and then shifted to the private sector. What really kind of drove that shift for you? And how was your initial experience, in the public sector that really pushed you to the private?
I think I always looked at, I didn't have my whole career planned out, but I always thought I would get my CPA certification. I would go into the corporate world, all along thinking about or preparing myself for something more entrepreneurial. So the first company I worked with was entrepreneurial, but was already a very established company, Shared Medical Systems, SMS in Malvern. And we were about $100 million in revenue when I got there, so it wasn't small. They were already public. And we grew to about 700 million while I was there. So it was very fast paced, very high growth, and but always knew that I had aspired to work with smaller companies and more entrepreneurial settings. But there are things that I learned at SMS that again carry through to this day. First and foremost, recurring revenue, and the value of having a consistent revenue stream that you could plan for as you grow your business, very key, and that's held true throughout the years where I've worked in a full-time basis, but also for my consulting clients.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you briefly touched on your entrepreneurial spirit, and you had a little bit of an entrepreneurial stint with your founding of IT Financial Incorporated. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that journey, founding that company and what really transpired out of that experience.
Well, it wasn't a direct path to IT Financial, and in fact, you may not see it on my LinkedIn profile, but when I left SMS, I actually worked for a very small company, small entrepreneurial company, and that's what I was drawn by. I was drawn by this $3 million company, 30 employees. They were involved with supporting software publishers. This was back in the day when you actually sent your software out in binders that had documentation as well as the disks that your software was stored on. But so I went to this small company and as their CFO, and it was very good experience. There was an aspect of it. The owner was a former lawyer, not to say anything bad about lawyers, but he worked in businesses before this one. And he had a little trouble with some of the other people and keeping some of the people on board. And so I didn't think it was the right choice for me. I was there for about a year, and I decided to go out on my own. I realized that once I relieved myself of this corporate blanket, the security blanket that you have when you're with perceived security blanket, I should say, when you're with a large company, the thought of going out and doing something on your own is much less risky. And I realized that it was no more risky to go out and do something on my own versus work for this very small company. And that's what I did. I first marketed myself as Jeff Stello, CPA. And I had this theory that there were small companies, $5 to $10 to $20 million of revenue, who may not be able to afford or justify the cost of a full-time CFO, but that they could benefit from using that type of person on a regular basis. Today we call it fractional CFO, and it's very common and it's a huge industry. But back when I first did this, there weren't many CPAs doing it, and it was very easy. Within 60 days, I had a complement of 4 clients, and I was literally the CFO for each of these 4 companies. So it was a very good experience, and worked with some dynamic companies, and eventually followed the market. The market told me where to go with this, that I moved also then to provide controller services and even full outsourced accounting services. Again, something that's very common today, but back before the SaaS-based technologies, it was not as common.
So you're showing up at these businesses with a big box and collecting a bunch of receipts and everything else, right? And then taking them back to your office and trying. It
wasn't quite that bad. It wasn't quite that bad, but yeah, we did. We would literally take files back to our office and process them, and then deliver reports to them electronically and hard copy.
Right. The SaaS model has certainly been an incredible time saver in that process, because the process hasn't changed, right? Just how you collect the data and interact with the client.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things that we see in your background is the opportunity you've had to work. You mentioned SMS as a public company, but I think you were also involved in an IPO process with a company and buying and selling companies. So that's always interesting, right? Sometimes entrepreneurs are buying and selling all the time, and sometimes people are building a business for that one-time sale. What have some of those experiences been like, and what have you learned going through those processes?
So one of my first clients when I was self-employed was a company called GMIS, And GMIS also was located in the Great Valley Corporate Center. It was a software development company focused on the healthcare industry. And there were quite a few ex-SMSers who worked at this company. So they were a client of mine. I was their part-time fractional CFO. They were a venture-backed company, and they had gotten to the point where they needed someone's services full-time. And I had always, that first time I went out on my own, it was always intended to find the right company to join, but I wouldn't consider it for the first 12 months. I needed to prove to myself that I could do what I had set out to do. But I ended up joining GMIS as their CFO. We did a number of acquisitions, and we also took the company public. This was pre-Sarbanes-Oxley, when it wasn't difficult or impossible to take a $50 million revenue company public. And it was very successful. And we later did a secondary offering and then followed on and sold to another public company competitor. So that was my first real opportunity as a CFO. I had told you about the earlier one, very small business, but I wasn't raising capital and I wasn't doing purchase acquisitions and wasn't involved in the selling of the business. But GMIS really cut my teeth in that area, and I did the natural thing, which was to go back out on my own. And that's when I started IT Financial. And now I felt like I had a lot of experience and services that I could market to other technology companies. And that was where my focus was, software companies and IT services companies, and went back out and did that for a period of time.
What was it like working with some of those venture-backed companies?
It was good. It was exciting. You were working with companies that were dealing with new technologies. I mean, that was the key, especially back in the 90s and early 2000 with the advent of the internet. Many of these companies weren't pre-revenue, but they were pre-profitability, and they needed capital, that type of capital, to build and grow their businesses. And you saw some very interesting teams doing some dynamic things, and it wasn't always the largest companies. So here SMS was a company of 3,000 employees, and then you're working with a company down the street that has 10 employees, and they're developing something that's never been developed before. So it was quite dynamic, quite interesting. And I was still, at that point, my focus was still in the financial area. So I was working with the companies as their CFO, either full-time or part-time. And I'll tell you one interesting sideline to this is that at that point, if I approached a life sciences company, which there are plenty of those in this area, we oftentimes refer to them as healthcare companies today, but they're biotech companies and the like, I couldn't sell my services to them to save my life because I didn't spend 10 or 15 years at Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer, and therefore I couldn't possibly know what their needs were from a financial standpoint, or at least that's the way the market perceived me.
Right.
And then I got introduced to a company called Pressamed, which was a Swiss-based medical device manufacturer in the orthopedic space. The founder of the business had moved here with his family from Switzerland to establish a beachhead in the U.S. market. And when I met him, he said, Jeff, I have all the people that could tell you anything you want to know about orthopedics. I need somebody to help me with my institutional investors, to help me do acquisitions, and to help me implement new ERP systems. And that's the experience you have. So he welcomed me in. We followed his strategy. This was first an instruments company where we had proprietary instruments for orthopedic procedures, non-invasive orthopedic procedures. And the CEO, Patrick Bordeaux, his vision was to put the full complement of instruments, implants, and sterilization cases together into one business, and then potentially look for an exit. And that's exactly what we did. We acquired a case manufacturer in Indiana, and we acquired an implant manufacturer from Johnson & Johnson Dupuy in France. And then we sold it to a public company that wanted to get into the orthopedic space, New York Stock Exchange company. And that's fun when you get that. When you're in a company that grows from 40 million to 140 million in a matter of 3 years, both organically and through acquisition, it's a lot of fun doing that.
Yeah, and now you're a healthcare company expert, right?
Oh yes, all the it was funny. Right after that, I did work for a vaccine development company down in Baltimore, and I did work for a number of life science companies.
Right.
As soon as I said medical device, FDA regulated, it was welcome in. You're one of us.
You get us. Come on board, right?
Exactly.
Funny.
So now with the companies and projects you're working with, do you see yourself kind of gravitating towards life sciences more, or is it kind of a versatile group of different industry clients?
Well, that's a good question. And so good question, Katie. I follow the market. In the last 8 years with Charlestown Capital Partners, the focus has been private equity firms and their portfolio companies. So there are some that do invest in that space, but the majority of them are working with established companies that have a credible cash flow that can finance the debt service that they're going to bring on to the business when they do their acquisitions. So most of them tend to be manufacturing companies, assembly companies, companies that provide logistics services to other companies, and they're less in the arena than the venture capital space typically invests. But it's also a fun environment. It's a no BS type of environment. They know they want to get from here to here, and they may or may not have all the people on the management team, or even if they do have the right management team and the right CFO, that team oftentimes needs to be supplemented with some additional resources to help them make the transition either from a privately owned business to one that's owned by private equity, or from a hands-off private equity firm to another private equity firm that's much more hands-on and much more demanding from their management team.
What's that like, handling that transition? I can, you have this, you hear about private equity all the time, right? Coming in, and the owner now has a big liquidity event, but maybe there's some expectation that they're going to stay with the business for a period of time. They probably haven't had someone as sophisticated as you from a financial standpoint. What is that like, working side by side with them, knowing that there's demands from the private equity firm, but you also have to work with the owner who still maybe has some responsibility for accelerating growth in the business?
Yes, I'll share another experience with you that I think answers that question, Mike. This was a company based in Elkhart, Indiana. And if you know anything about Elkhart, Indiana, it's the RV capital of the world. So most of the trailers and most of the RVs that you see on the road today, probably 70% of them are built in Elkhart, Indiana. And there was a business out there that was owned by one individual. He started the business. He was running it for 12 years. And he had just completed, they were about to complete a transaction where he sold 70% of his business. He was going to retain 30% ownership. But one of the requirements from the new private equity owners was that there would be a new professional manager or CEO brought into the business. And interestingly, so I had been gravitating from the financial side to the general management side prior to that time period, and I had a call from Barry Smith at Pine Hill, now part of CFGI, and Barry called me because he had a call from a client or a prospect who needed an interim CEO. They needed somebody. They didn't want this deal to go away, and they didn't have a new CEO to bring in there to work with the owner entrepreneur. So we went and we pitched the idea, and they agreed to hire us. I went out to Indiana in the middle of the night. I arrived because it's not an easy place to get to. And the owner was very welcoming. He was very nice. I remember the introduction phone call before I came out to his facility. And he said, "Jeff, you sound like a nice guy, but why would I spend 3 months teaching you everything about my business and you're just going to leave?" And I said, "Well, Tim, that's a good question." I said, "For one, your new owners want that. And so you don't really have the same choice as you might have had before. Right. You made that decision. And secondly, hopefully I can help you get a sense of what it's like to share that, because you're going to have someone else come in here full time to work with you as your new CEO, and hopefully I can help you get used to that idea, and that help be a bridge for you in bringing that person in. And it turned out I was there it was supposed to be a 3-month engagement, and it ended up being 6 months. And the first few weeks, Tim was very helpful, helped me understand the business. This was something I had never worked with him before in automotive or this type of upfitting, they called it. And it was very helpful, shared with me all the information. And it wasn't too long, maybe 3 weeks into it, because I would leave on a Friday night, and then fly back out on Sunday night so I could be there first thing Monday morning. But about 3 weeks into it, he came in Monday morning and he said, "Jeff, I was thinking about what we were talking about on Thursday and Friday before you left. And what if we did this?" So the dynamic changed very, very quickly. Once he had trust in me and confidence in me, it became much more of a collaborative effort of sharing ideas and not just trying different things, but actually doing different things. And long story short, and I could tell you a lot of in-betweens, but in 2 months, this was a $20 million business the year before. It wasn't a large business, $5 million a quarter. And the first quarter, when I got there, we did 5 million, just like the previous year. The second quarter, we did 6.5, and the third quarter, we did 8. So we made some very significant improvements. That some areas were things that were not his babies. One area which was the manufacturing area. He didn't want me to touch or mess around with that, but I couldn't help myself, and I got involved and started asking questions down on the floor, and we eliminated some of the bottlenecks, and we put further accountability into some meetings that we had with the workstation heads. And before you know it, we were putting 6 vehicles out a week instead of 5, and that sounds like a small improvement. But as I said, the difference was 5 million of quarterly revenue versus 8 million of quarterly revenue. And they had struggled to try to do that. They had moved into a new building, hired some new people and new equipment, but they couldn't get past this 5 vehicles per week until we made some of these changes.
That's great. That's a great story. I mean, that gives you some insight into I think part of it is your personality too, and how you're able to work with them. So you only have about a minute left. You have a great bookcase there. What's one book that you're reading on that bookcase that you're really enjoying?
Well, the one that I read and I also bring back on a regular basis, and you're going to hear it in some of the questions or the answers that you may hear, is Good to Great by Jim Collins. And the key theme of that is getting the right people on the bus and getting the right people in the right seats. Because I've gone into certain situations where I'll tell you very quickly. Did you say we have a minute to go?
Yep.
Okay. Well, sometimes you don't see that, but if you get the right people on the bus and in the right seats, and that doesn't mean you have to make a wholesale change with management.
Right.
You just have to work with people's strengths, and you can make some very significant improvements.
It's amazing when you get the right people doing, like you said, the right seat, what tremendous changes you can make. Jeff, this has been great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your insight today. Hopefully entrepreneurs listening got good insight there. The next guest on Money Matters TV is Roger Nance with Dayton Capital Growth. As a reminder, you can download the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, as well as see the YouTube channel money-matterstv.com. Thank you for joining us for Growth Stories.